What if I told you that the story of modern finance isn't the tale of nations rising and falling, or the triumph of governments and corporations? What if instead, it's the story of families, dynasties whose influence stretches across centuries, quietly shaping the world from behind closed doors? Not the names you see on the news or the logos on skyscrapers, not even the banks themselves, but the people who built the very foundations those institutions stand on. These are families whose names you won't find on election ballots, whose signatures rarely appear on treaties or constitutions. Their legacies are hidden in the margins of history books, whispered in the corridors of power, and etched in the faded ink of ancient ledgers. Yet, their influence echoes through the marble halls of central banks, in the invisible architecture of debt systems, and even in the chaos of wars. Wars often fought not just for land or ideology, but for control over money itself. These families understood a secret that would change the course of history. Money doesn't simply follow power. In fact, it's the other way around. Power, in all its forms, political, military, cultural, inevitably follows the flow of money, and those who control the money control the future. Tonight, we're not diving into wild conspiracy theories or shadowy cabals. Instead, we're exploring a story of continuity, a legacy passed down through generations, often hidden in plain sight. This is about the slow, deliberate construction of a system that outlasts kings, revolutions, and even empires. The modern financial system didn't just materialize out of thin air. It was carefully built, brick by brick, ledger by ledger, and, most importantly, handed down like a family heirloom. Each generation adding its own layer, its own secrets, its own ambitions. And perhaps the most unsettling truth? Most people have no idea who truly inherited this system. The real architects remain hidden, their influence felt but rarely seen. Their decisions ripple through our lives, shaping economies, opportunities, and even the fate of nations, often without us ever knowing their names. So tonight we journey back, before the first banks, before the stock markets, before the rise of countries as we know them, to uncover the hidden architects of finance, and the families who changed the world forever. Before paper money, before credit cards, before interest rates, there were merchant families. In ancient Mesopotamia, temples and elite households issued grain loans. In Babylon, families recorded debt on clay tablets. Some still exist, but it was ancient Rome where financial dynasties truly emerged. The Argentarii, private banking families, financed trade, wars, and politicians. They didn't rule Rome publicly, they ruled it quietly, by deciding who received liquidity. When Rome collapsed, those families didn't disappear. They adapted, and they moved. Fast forward to medieval Europe, a time of bustling city-states, grand cathedrals, and a new kind of power rising from the heart of the continent. In these winding streets and crowded marketplaces, something revolutionary was taking shape, something that would change the world forever. Florence wasn't powerful because of armies or conquests. Unlike the empires built on swords and shields, Florence's influence came from something far less visible, but far more enduring. Florence was powerful because of ledgers, because of numbers inked onto parchment, carefully tracked and meticulously balanced. These records held the true wealth of the city, and with them, Florence quietly shaped the fate of nations. At the center of it all stood one extraordinary family, the Medici. They didn't just participate in this new financial world, they mastered it, turning banking into an art form and a weapon. The Medici didn't invent banking, but they perfected networked finance. Their branches stretched across Europe, connecting distant capitals and royal courts. They pioneered double-entry bookkeeping, a system so effective it's still used today. They manipulated currency exchange, financed kings and popes, and even funded wars, quietly pulling the strings behind the scenes. Here's the key detail most people miss. The Medici didn't rule Florence through force or fear. Their power wasn't enforced by soldiers but by something far more subtle and enduring. They ruled by credit dependency. Through loans and financial agreements they made the city and much of Europe dependent on their goodwill and their gold. When leaders owed them money, they owed them loyalty. The Medici's influence reached into the highest halls of power, shaping decisions and destinies. Sound familiar? It should. This model, private capital influencing public power, never disappeared. It simply evolved, growing more complex and more global. The story of modern finance begins here, in the streets of Florence, but its legacy is all around us today. As nation-states formed, families did something smarter than loyalty to flags. They married across borders. The Fugger family of Germany financed the Holy Roman Empire. They decided who became emperor. The Welser family controlled trade routes and colonial ventures. These weren't banks yet. They were financial bloodlines. They understood three rules. Nations rise and fall. Debt outlives governments. Control credit, and you control outcomes. Then came the industrial age, and finance changed forever. No discussion of financial dynasties is complete without mentioning the Rothschilds. Their name is synonymous with wealth, influence, and, perhaps most importantly, timing. The Rothschilds didn't just accumulate riches, they mastered the art of being in the right place, with the right knowledge, at the right moment. But let's be clear, the myth that they secretly control everything is just that, a myth. It's a convenient story, but it misses the real genius behind their legacy. The truth is far more nuanced, and, in many ways, more impressive. What set the Rothschilds apart was their ability to gather, interpret, and act on information faster than anyone else. They didn't invent banking, but they revolutionized how information could be leveraged for financial gain. This was the original information arbitrage, knowing something before the rest of the world, and using that edge to make bold moves. In the early 1800s, Europe was a patchwork of kingdoms, empires, and city-states, each with its own secrets and ambitions. The Rothschilds built a private intelligence network that spanned the continent, connecting Frankfurt, London, Paris, Vienna, and Naples. They used every tool available: carrier pigeons darting across borders, trusted couriers on horseback, and encrypted letters sealed with wax. These weren't just messages, they were lifelines of opportunity, carrying news of battles, treaties, and market shifts. With this network, the Rothschilds often knew the outcome of wars, political upheavals, and economic crises before anyone else. Imagine the power of being the first to know whether a king had fallen or a treaty had been signed, while others waited days or weeks for the news. And in finance, timing is everything. Markets don't just move on money, they move on information. The Rothschilds understood this better than anyone, and they used it to their advantage, time and again. Their influence was so profound that they could finance both sides of a conflict, not because they were driven by ideology, but because they recognized the inevitability of debt in war. Wars create debt, and debt creates leverage. The Rothschilds saw opportunity where others saw only chaos. In their hands, war became more than a political event. It became an investment strategy. They played the long game, moving capital like chess pieces on a grand European board. By the time central banks began to rise in power, the Rothschilds had already demonstrated a crucial lesson. Private capital, when combined with superior information, could outmaneuver even the mightiest governments. Their model showed that a well-informed private network could move faster, act smarter, and ultimately shape the fate of nations, sometimes more decisively than kings or parliaments. That lesson didn't just echo through the 19th century, it became the foundation of the modern financial order, where information is power, and those who control it shape the world. Here's where the story gets uncomfortable. By the 20th century, family names began disappearing, not because they lost power, but because institutions became masks: central banks, international monetary funds, private investment firms, ownership structures layered behind trusts, holdings, foundations. The families didn't vanish, they professionalized. The model stayed the same: control liquidity, influence policy, remain unelected, avoid accountability. Modern finance didn't kill dynasties, it hid them better. Let's step back for a moment. Across 2,000 years, the pattern never changes. Empires rise, currencies fail, borders shift, but financial families survive because they don't depend on nations. They depend on systems. When monarchies fell, they funded republics. When gold disappeared, they backed fiat. When cash faded, they moved to digital abstraction. The form of money changes, the control structure doesn't. And the most important realization? Modern finance isn't broken, it's working exactly as designed. So, here's the question. Nobody asks. If financial power has always been inherited, If systems reward continuity over democracy, if the same structures repeat across centuries, then what does economic freedom actually mean? And more importantly, who really owns the future of money? Because history suggests one thing very clearly: money doesn't forget, power doesn't reset, and families who mastered finance centuries ago are still playing the long game. The only difference now, the system is invisible, and you're inside it.